Hey everyone, I am so excited to be doing this panel on the future of environmental and social justice. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope you've been having a really great time at the Marketplace of the Future. Before we get started, I just wanted to include a quick notes from our event sponsors. I wanted to thank the Start Lehigh building located in West Chelsea, Manhattan. It is the home and birthplace of the Marketplace of the Future. The building has replaced 8 miles of windows to conserve energy, offered free building-wide composting, and installed a rooftop garden with bees, and continues to be a supporter and sponsor until this day. Also wanted to thank Pildora. It's a community and one-stop shop for sustainable fashion, accessories, and clean beauty, featuring over 100 impactful brands from over 25 countries. Shop on Pildora.com and visit them in the Lifestyle Pavilion. And last but not least, Just Salad is the first US restaurant chain to carbon label their menu, making it easier than ever to make more sustainable food choices. You can order today at orderjustsalad.com and visit them in the agriculture and food zone. Just a quick note, if you have any questions during this panel that you'd love to have the panelists speak about, feel free to use the Q&A function in Zoom, and then we'll talk about them at the end. Yeah, I'm very excited. I'm so excited to have these folks on this panel. So I want to kick things off. We have a special guest that wasn't listed, but am so excited to have her on. Her name is Yemi Amu. She is the founder and director of Oko Farms. Oko Farms is an aquaponics production, education, and research organization based here in Brooklyn, New York. They operate NYC's only outdoor and publicly accessible aquaponics farm. So I will let Yemi tell you a little bit more about her work. Yeah.
Oh, great. Hi, everyone. I wasn't sure if you can hear me. I also don't have video access. Oh, there we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Yemi. I'm happy to participate in this event today. Unfortunately, I can't be on the panel because I'm harvesting produce for a market tomorrow. Sorry, that was an Amber Alert that came on my phone. I'm harvesting produce for market tomorrow, and it's getting dark, as you can see. But this is Oko Farms. It is an outdoor aquaponics farm in New York City. We set up this farm in Bushwick, New York in 2013. At the time, there were no aquaponics. There was one aquaponics farm actually in the city, but it was in the basement of a high school. And we wanted to demonstrate aquaponics to New York City residents and really to the world as a system of agriculture that could really help mitigate some of the impact of climate change and help increase food security for folks who live in food insecure environments. So we're outside deliberately. We're because we want to make aquaponics and the knowledge to farm using aquaponics accessible to everyone. Our farm is as low tech as you can get because I want you to, wherever you are, regardless of how much money you earn, I want you to be able to either start aquaponics for yourself and your community or to start it as a way to earn income for yourself. So I'm going to walk around the farm a little bit. I think I have to turn my camera the other way. I'm going to show you our farm. So here we are. I'm going to kind of start in the front, which is where you will be if you first walk in. So this is where the plants are. But before I walk you through all of that, I'm just going to take you into the greenhouse so that you can see our fish because they really are the heart of the farm. These guys over here, they're hungry. They're saying hello. This is just a 6x16 tank that we dug in the ground. We have mostly carp here, goldfish and koi, mirror carp. There's some bluegill. Over here, you can't see them because they don't want to be seen, but we have channel catfish. And then we also have some tilapia over there. And then if you come out here is where we have our produce. We grow a really wide variety of produce because we're trying to educate people about what's possible to grow in aquaponics. So there is research involved. This is sorghum that you're looking at over here. We have to cover it because of birds, but it is a grain that is edible. And for those of you who are gluten-free, I'm sure you've come across sorghum flour. The stems are also pretty edible. I'll show you some bigger ones that we have below. Here you can see we have beets and collards. Another bed with, we have okra growing here. These are actually sweet potato greens because we're growing sweet potatoes, our first time growing that this year. This is more of the sorghum. As you can see, it's a pretty tall plant. This is some amaranth greens, more sorghum. We have a lot of mint over here. This is some cabbage that we just put in. We do have some soil stuff on the side because we do comparisons. This over here is, we have some zucchini squash. Our first time doing that, so it's really cool to see. Actually, it's a pumpkin rather than a zucchini. We have lemongrass here. It's one of the most popular things we sell at our farmers markets and to our other clients. We have bergamot, marshmallow plants. Over there used to be rice. We've harvested most of it. More greens that we just put in, chives, watercress over here, some Japanese parsley, lemon sorrel, and more watercress that we're growing. That's going to take us essentially into the winter season. And back there is nasturtiums, shiso, and more mint. And then on the side, we have soil plants as well, just as a way to maximize our growing space. So yeah, this is us. And this site is about 2,500 square feet from the gate all the way to the back. And we do a combination of education and farming. We do a wide variety of fish, but a lot of our fish are not for sale. They're really more for us to learn how to raise the fish, how to raise different kinds of fish and what requirements are, and to raise fish using like the most minimal amount of technology possible, knowing that most of the folks we work with live in communities that don't have access to a lot of money and resources for expensive things, and are looking for ways to increase food security. So we work with people in Brownsville. We have some folks that we worked with in both Rockaway and Far Rockaway, sorry, in Queens, and also in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. We're currently working with someone in Haiti right now, and also in Senegal. In Senegal, they're particularly interested in aquaponics because of its ability to conserve water. They've been facing some droughts there, which has been negatively impacting a lot of the farmers there. And the organization that I'm working with is looking to help support the farmers to continue to generate income and to continue their living as farmers, instead of them quitting and all moving to the city in large numbers. So that's it. That's us. I don't know if you have any more. I try to do that as quickly as possible because I know I only have 10 minutes.
That was incredible. Thank you so much for giving a tour of that. I can't believe that space is in Brooklyn, New York. I'm excited to check it out.
Yeah.
Where can our folks find you? How can they support you and the work that you do?
We are at www.ocofarms.org on our website. We're actually raising money so that we can move beyond the space, so that we can grow more, we can experiment more, we can also engage people more. And you can find us on all the socials at Oco Farms. So at Oco Farms on Instagram, at Oco Farms on Twitter, and I believe it's Oco Farms, facebook.com/Oco Farms on Facebook. And then I think it's LinkedIn, it's Oco Farms. So it's Oco Farms everywhere consistently. We also offer classes and workshops that you can learn more about on our website as well.
Amazing. I put all those links in the chat. So for everyone who is watching this right now, please go to ocofarms.org and donate. Thank you so much, Yemi, for sharing the farm and sharing the work that you're doing.
Thank you for having me.
Of
I'm a
course.
great panel.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Great. Yeah, and now we're on to our discussion. I wanted to introduce our amazing panelists. I'm so excited to have this conversation with them. First off is Milana Roberts. She is a community food activist and chair of Food Secure Canada. Milana Roberts is a municipal and federal food policy activist and food justice organizer based in Toronto. She's working to bridge the gaps between policy, social justice, and community. Milana's work centers on democratizing decision-making in our food system. She is passionate about ensuring Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities who are most impacted by food policies have the power and capacity to shape the policy decisions that influence their lives. Recently working in politics, Milana is now the project manager for the Power Lab, where she works to build community power on issues of climate policy, community land ownership, and equitable development. She also brings diverse experiences managing an urban farm, community gardens, food security, anti-poverty, and community development initiatives in Canada, Ecuador, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and Guyana. Milana is also chair of Food Secure Canada, a national policy alliance working to build a more equitable and intersectional local food movement. She also holds positions as a member of the Toronto Food Policy Council, a global advisor to agritecture, a 2021 Action Canada Fellow, and was named one of Metro Morning's Next Gen 10 People Influencing the Future of Food in Canada. Thank you so much, Milana, for being part of this. Your bio and resume they speak so many volumes. I'm curious, how did you get into this work, and what's it been like working on these issues on a hands-on perspective, working on urban farms and community gardens, to being more involved in these issues on a policy level?
Well, first off, I want to thank you, Peter, for having me. I think this is going to be a really exciting discussion, and what a great way to kind of end and put a cap on Climate Week. And I was actually hoping if I could start by acknowledging something that I feel like is essential to setting the groundwork for this discussion. Here in Canada, we are on stolen land of Indigenous peoples, and so as a way to acknowledge the inequities that persist in conversations about land and about environmental justice, we like to open all discussions, meetings, and opportunities to share and learn with the land acknowledgement. So I just want to acknowledge the land that Leslie and I are on here in Toronto, the other panelists. So the City of Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations and is currently recognized as lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, but it is also recognized as a home to many nations, including Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples. And so in doing that, I just want to recognize that this land has a lot of issues and challenges, and there are people who we can turn to and learn from to think about the best ways to move forward and thinking about solutions to make the land a better place. Coming back to your question about how my work is kind of connected to this conversation and some of the things I hope to share today. I feel really lucky to kind of bring a couple of different experiences and hats to today's discussion. Some of the work I'm really passionate about and that I think really brings a unique kind of piece to this discussion is really thinking about my work that has to do on two fronts. So one, thinking about decision-making tables. So, right now climate is such a big issue. They're thinking about all these like really high-level policies and programs and initiatives to drive goals for 2030 and 2050, really recognizing that the clock is ticking to make an impact. But I think one of the big challenges is we have people who are making decisions about what the future of climate initiatives look like. And they're not necessarily the people who are most impacted by these decisions. I opened up by acknowledging the land of Indigenous peoples, and I think that is an example of a key voice that isn't at a lot of those key decision-making tables. And so, work that I've been very involved in, you heard in my bio with food policy councils, and I think that's one example of decision-making tables that not only reflect folks who are leading, but people across different sectors. So food policy councils are intersectional tables that bring people from across the food system, people who are farmers, people who are working on policy, people who are academics, people growing food like we saw Yemi. So I think it's really critical because it helps bring all these different perspectives to come up with better solutions. Another kind of work that I'm really excited about is very new work in the city of Toronto, but not new among grassroots communities, is an initiative in Toronto looking to drive Black food sovereignty. So I've been recently working to facilitate, and I'm very privileged to support the work of Black community leaders here in Toronto and organizations, including the African Food Basket. And that initiative is really trying to figure out, what does Black food sovereignty look like here in the city of Toronto? How can we think about historic injustices and inequalities, and how land and conversations around sovereignty can actually empower the Black community to increase food security, economic development, and more climate-friendly approaches to accessing, sharing, and distributing food locally within the community. And maybe the last thing I'll talk about that I'm really hoping to dig in today is work that really excites me, that's more focused on how do we bridge kind of climate work, work around health and well-being, now that we're in a COVID crisis at the moment, work around economic justice, and work really around racial justice. And my work with the Power Lab is a great example of that. You know, in the Power Lab, we do a lot of different things working to build power in communities so that decisions are community driven. And I think it's a great example about how we empower and support, create space for folks to make decisions about their own lives. So doing everything from working with community to develop things like a climate job strategy of like what the future of work and jobs look like to drive climate change, to supporting people to create businesses and supports that actually are more just and more community driven and support broader climate goals, to thinking about, you know, how do we create more community owned land to support and cultivate practices and share traditional teaching and knowledge. So those are some of the things I'm excited about right now in my work, and that I'm really looking forward to digging in with you today.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm excited to dig into a lot of these as well. We also have on the panel today Leslie Campbell. Leslie Campbell is a senior coordinator of special projects at FoodShare Toronto, also a fellow folk from Toronto. Leslie is a food justice advocate with a background in tropical agroecology and community food security. As a student, Leslie spent a year in northern Thailand managing an organic farm and developing an agricultural training curriculum, which inspired him to pursue a master's degree in geography focusing on the social and ecological aspects of food systems. He then returned overseas, spending 2 years teaching agriculture in Indonesia and 2 years working in agricultural research and training in Ethiopia, after which Leslie returned to Canada, excited to engage with food issues more locally. Leslie now works for FoodShare Toronto, where he supports community-led food access initiatives, research, and advocacy. This work seeks to broaden conversations about food insecurity to include discussions of the many systems of oppression that hold it in place, systems like colonialism, capitalism, systemic racism, and patriarchy. He believes strongly in income-based solutions to food insecurity as implemented alongside universally accessible public services and in need for those most impacted by these issues to lead the solution finding process. It sounds like both you and Milana have been in a lot of different places around the world doing the work that you do. I'm curious, Leslie, what drew you back to Canada? What was it like for you to have worked in these regions and to come back to Canada?
Yeah, I mean, it was challenging, I think, to kind of translate some of that international work to conversations back here in Canada, but also I think important because of kind of just the recognition that so often a lot of the work that is taking place in the international development space and in international food security as well can sometimes be driven by actors from the West or actors from the North, places like North America going, or folks from North America going to other parts of the world and kind of looking at kind of Western-led solutions to perhaps problems that are more effectively addressed by local solutions and that sort of thing. And so I think in recognizing just how much power and innovation and expertise and ingenuity exists within farming communities internationally, kind of recognizing that power, then I think I came to the conclusion that it was kind of more important for me to apply my skills and training in a domestic context here in Canada.
That's great to
I
hear
mean,
that
we've
you've been
got
able
plenty of
to.
issues to deal with here as well. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great to hear that you've been able to really tie a lot of those experiences back into your work in Toronto and Canada. Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, really, I wanted to center this discussion on how we can make sure that the environmental movement is an intersectional social justice movement, and how we can give power and build resilience to those communities that are most impacted by climate change. I think, based on the conversations that we've all had, climate change and the environmental movement is often a movement that prioritizes the environment and leaves historically disenfranchised populations out of the conversation. And when we both discussed this topic, I think specifically around COVID-19, in your work, it seemed like it was a glimpse of how climate change highlights the inequities in a glimpse of how climate change might highlight inequities in our society. So, I want to hear from both of you. How has COVID-19 affected your work and the communities that you serve?
Do you want to go first, Milana? Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in, and then I'm sure you'll have a lot to add and build on that. So yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think is one that I feel like needs a lot more attention. I think we've heard a lot about how COVID-19 has really been a big wake-up call in a lot of different ways. It's really revealed serious inequities in our in our healthcare system and who is receiving the best quality of care, and how particularly Black folks, but a lot of different communities are not well served by our healthcare system. In Canada, we do have a public healthcare system, and so access based on income is not necessarily a factor, but questions around how discrimination and racial discrimination particularly biases the way that certain communities are supported and believed about symptoms and challenges, it is a serious area of concern in terms of how effective treatment and care is. We've seen real challenges around how people are able to access food. Here in Canada, we have seen a real big challenge where you go into the grocery store and you look at the shelves and food is flying off the shelves. So when you think about who's able to wait in line for hours to get groceries and to be able to feed their family, when you think about the hours that grocery stores are open, being shorter, and people who are working multiple jobs being able to access, let alone the rising cost of food as a result of the increased production elements that are needed and restrictions that are increasing the cost of food, make it all the more challenging for low-income folks, Black folks, Indigenous peoples, single parent households to be able to afford the cost of rising food. And when you think about that, that gets even more challenging when you think about the increased costs of food production, and the increased pressure on producers also translates to the, racialized people, particularly Black Mexicans and Jamaicans in Canada through the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. We often talk about them as migrant workers, are working in even more detrimental conditions. Not only are they in deplorable housing conditions, but you're also seeing them working in unsafe health conditions, not having proper protective equipment. So, in Canada, we saw crazy numbers, like thousands of migrant workers being infected with COVID-19 because of those poor working conditions. And despite the recognition and people calling the alarm and blowing the whistle on that, we still saw these workers being expected to work in those conditions. And so we see how amongst this pandemic, there's a real privilege around who is able to stay home and work, what conditions are people able to work under. There are a lot of folks who are don't have the luxury of saying, I'm going to work from home. And they're considered essential workers. The number of essential workers who are racialized, and in addition to that, you see grocery store workers who you know, the rest of us depend on to be there, but we're not seeing the benefits trickle down to them in terms of having better wages or more economic benefits for bearing the brunt of the risk of operating in this time. And maybe one other thing, the last thing I'll maybe say is, when we think about COVID-19 and the impact, whether that's food insecurity, and I'm sure Leslie will, you know, FoodShare's done incredible work about unveiling, you know, the numbers of the rates of food insecurity among racialized groups. I'm sure Leslie will speak to that. So, but what I would really highlight is when we see the disparity, the levels of food insecurity, the access to healthcare, the number of people having to choose precarious jobs, you also are concerned about the fact that these are issues that are on top of pre-existing inequalities and structural environmental racism, where folks who are racialized often are more likely to live in homes and buildings that are poorly built, you know, coming into climate and environmental elements about, you know, homes needing to be more environmentally friendly, and also have less access to green space and other social determinants of health. And you can see that in Indigenous communities. In Canada, we still have more than 11 communities that don't have access to clean drinking water. So if you are in a community living in reserve and you don't have access to clean drinking water, imagine how that's also impacting, you know, how you're a forager or a gatherer, how the quality of your environment is also, you know, impacting your resilience to be able to address challenges like COVID-19.
Beautifully said. Yeah, I agree with all of that and more. I guess I'm reminded of just, I mean, yesterday was the first time, I think, since March that I was on the transit in Toronto. I've been cycling around all summer, trying to stay physically distant. But yesterday I was on the subway and I was just really struck looking around by kind of who else was on the subway heading home from work. It was largely women of color. And these are the folks who are out on the front lines, who are working in grocery stores, who are stocking shelves, who are kind of doing that work that we all need to keep our kind of societies moving, and whose work is so often super devalued. And so COVID is kind of highlighting all of these pre-existing inequalities. And I mean, Milana was also talking about kind of grocery stores and food availability and food shortages, and not only kind of who can stand in line at grocery stores, but also like who has the available cash to stockpile goods, as we saw happening all over the place as COVID set in and lockdowns hit. I think all of that kind of highlights who is in a position to be isolated from the impacts of something like this. And I have been talking the last couple of days with friends about how kind of COVID is really, it's almost like a sneak peek at some of perhaps what we can expect in terms of the impacts of climate change, in terms of how we're seeing disruptions to the food systems upon which we rely upon the value chains that bring food from farms to our tables here at home, value chains that over time have gotten longer and longer as we rely more on food from elsewhere in the world, but that are increasingly susceptible to be disrupted by the impacts of climate change or the impacts of a disruption like a pandemic. And I also think it's really important to remember that like things like COVID and things like climate change as well don't happen in a vacuum. Like it's not as though climate change will be the only thing that we are needing to confront or to deal with. We will still likely have future pandemics. We will likely still have, we're going to be seeing natural disasters happen in the same context. And so other crises will still happen. And so as we see the fallout from COVID falling along these same lines of social inequality, I feel like that is just it points to the dire need to address some of these systems of inequities in order to mitigate these longer term impacts that we expect to see again and again. And I mean, Milana did mention also some of the research that FoodShare was involved in that I'd like to kind of speak to quickly, because this was research that took place before COVID-19 hit. And so FoodShare runs community-led food access initiatives across the city of Toronto, and supports communities in advocating for their rights, and also to reduce the barriers that they face in accessing the food that they need. And in many of the programs that we run in our kind of low-cost fruit and vegetable markets, for example, we've historically just seen a lot of people of color accessing the programs and kind of taken note of that, but not always had kind of the data to back up what we were seeing or why this might be. And so that led in 2019 for FoodShare to enter into a research partnership with a group called Proof at the University of Toronto. And this research team, alongside FoodShare, conducted the first study looking at the difference between household food insecurity between Black and white households in Canada, really trying to kind of quantify what the inequities we were seeing in practice kind of looked like based on the data. And the findings that that were found from the study absolutely floored us. Although they told us exactly what leaders in the Black community had been saying for years. This research found that Black households in Canada were 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure than white households. It found that 10% of white households were food insecure on average versus 28% of Black households. The research also found that while 12% of white children grow up in food insecure households, 36% of Black children are living in food insecure households. Additionally, we also looked at housing and how that it impacts food insecurity. And normally when you look at housing on the population level on a whole, if you own your home, you are much more likely to be able to, or you're much less likely to be food insecure. And this is because if you encounter an unexpected financial shock, you can likely borrow against the value of your home in order to access the money you need to weather that shock. Now, what we saw was that this was true when you look at the population as a whole. And it was also true if you look at white households. But if you look at Black households, then Black households that are renting their homes are actually at the same, Black homeowners who own their homes are at the same risk of food insecurity as white renters. And so owning your home, if you are Black, is not protective against food insecurity. You are at similarly high risk, regardless of whether you own or rent. Similarly, household composition, whether you are in a single parent-led household or a multi-parent-led household. Normally, having a multi-parent-led household means that you are less likely to be food insecure. But again, when you drill down and look at it disaggregated by race, for white households, then this holds true, but if for Black households, this does not hold true. You have similarly high risk of food insecurity, whether you are in a single or multi-parent-led household. And so kind of all of this is, again, evidence that's pointing to the systems of inequity that Black folks and other communities certainly are having to navigate in accessing the resources that they need, basically to access money and food and other resources. And so things like COVID are really just kind of pointing to these bigger problems of inequality that are ubiquitous in our society and that we need to address in order to begin dismantling some of these other problems. And like you said in my introduction, these are systems that are kind of held in place by white supremacy and systemic racism and colonialism and capitalism and kind of all of those other systems of oppression that constrict the choices that people have at their disposal.
Mm-hmm. I think it is so clear that an issue like food security just has such empirical evidence of showing the inequality that exists in these communities. You know, and I like what you said, you know, previously. These issues don't exist in a vacuum, and sometimes within this larger environmental movement, we think that it does. We think that environmental issues are environmental issues and racial issues are racial issues. And I'm curious, you know, in your experience, when you're speaking with folks who might not see how interconnected and intersectional these issues are, how do you navigate the naysayers, the folks who say, this is an issue of food and not about race or about gender or about wealth inequality or tied to the systems of oppression that are in place?
I mean, for me personally, I think in this moment, I really question how people don't see the connections. And so for me, it's often sometimes hitting it from a different angle and really thinking about, you know, some people thinking with an intersectional lens is really requiring them to think about identities, is trying to allow them to, you know, empathize with the idea that people can be more than one thing. You know, you can identify as, you know, being a woman, you could identify as being a mother, you could also identify as being a professor, you could identify as being, a woman of Asian descent. Like there are all these multiple different identities and identifiers that allow us to navigate differently in the world. And so, you know, once you start to get a person to understand that, which at a basic level, most people can understand, you can start to then, you know, have them understand that then your experience in the world, how you navigate through it, how you are able to access power and access decision making, and what spaces you happen to be in because of that social location shift. And often, and that doesn't always click for everyone. So sometimes what I often like to do, as I said, is to come at a different perspective and really come down to, well, let's think about it from, you know, the collective benefit of what would it mean if we were using this intersectional lens, and how can it actually help us to come up with better solutions? And I think, you know, you can think of lots of examples, both Leslie and I have worked abroad, and you can think of a lot of examples of where you have someone who's well-meaning, whether they're NGOs or whether they're, climate volunteers, that thinking about projects and ways to improve communities. So, you know, oftentimes, you know, my background is in international development. And so often a lot of the work I've done has come from that lens. And I can think of a number of projects in my time working in Ecuador with working with conservationists, and, you know, having different projects trying to conserve and, protect national parks and ensure that the land in national parks was being protected. There's a lot of biodiversity there, which is extremely important. But these were the same lands where there are many indigenous people living and practicing. And there was kind of, you know, a relatively harmonious agreement of them living subsistence nature off those lands. But with this conservationist, there was a real push that there was an understanding that these practices that have been happening there for, you know, generations were somehow impeding the ability to protect and conserve and execute climate leadership and stewardship in a particular, very narrow way. And so eventually, those parklands were actually cordoned off and could only be visited. No longer were these indigenous people able to live in this park. And this was done under the guise of, supporting climate activism and protecting nature. And I think, you know, had they considered that these indigenous peoples were actually part of cultivating and enriching the biodiversity of these lands, it would be a different conversation, taking into account all the elements of their identity. And I think, like, there, you know, now we're actually some negative consequences to that project that actually ended up to reduce the biodiversity and the natural ecosystem of that area. And I can think of many projects like that where you think about, I've worked in indigenous communities in Guatemala, subsistence communities of farmers, where you had mixed ancestry, indigenous Mayan peoples working together, men and women. And women in these communities were actually paid less than their male counterparts. And as a result, these women in these communities are often providing, they're seen as the caretakers of the home. Not only their income is directly going to the family, whereas their male counterparts may not. And so as a result, they were actually starting to use other things like pesticides and fertilizer to increase their crop, to be able to have more, to be able to sell more at the market to compensate for the difference in the pay of their work. And so, the non-governmental organization I was working with, their solution was, okay, well, we need to just teach them different methods because they need to just learn a different method to support it. But in fact, if they had thought from an intersectional lens about that it's because they're women and because of their commitments to their household and because of the disparity between how much they were earning, they could actually have found different ways to ensure that the women were paid the same as men, and would actually go back to using the traditional practices they were using previously, which were more environmentally friendly and didn't use any pesticides, similarly to their male counterparts. So thinking about how this different lens could actually solve multiple issues and bring everyone, raise the, you know, raising the tide to bring the sail up for all the ships, you know, to improve for the lowest common denominator, to improve for everyone. And I also think, you know, another approach that I think has been really important to bring this intersectional lens is create space for more diverse leadership at the table. If you have different kinds of folks, you know, I talked a little bit earlier about the Food Policy Council, and there's lots of ways to think about diversity. There's diversity in identity. You know, we talked about gender, race, sexuality, geographic representation of folks at the table, but there's also, you know, real opportunities to also think about, you know, across a sector. So you have folks who are working with one particular perspective, but having industry at the table, having government at the table. It provides an opportunity to have more complex solutions. And in the end, what it really does is it creates an opportunity to shift the power dynamic. And all of these systems we talked about, all these inequities are actually perpetuated by the fact that the power to make decisions is not equally distributed. And if it were, we would have decisions that impact people's lives in a different way. And so what that can do is actually, in the climate movement, a real opportunity to shift the narrative about what does climate change work mean? How can we have more climate change work actually reflect a commitment to climate justice? How can we see climate change work as being the same as economic justice, as actually being intersectional with achieving food justice, with actually reflecting a drive and the principles around gender justice? And I think the more time and space we spend with different opinions, the better our work will be to find the convergence and alignment to shift the movement forward in a more inclusive and a more effective way to actually move the needle. Because the fact is, and you know, I think politics right now is a great example of that, the real polarizing set of opinions. But the more you spend time with people, you'll recognize we're all people and there are things we share in common. And I think it's the opportunity to cultivate those spaces where you see some of that leadership. So just maybe to give one last example is, you know, I've recently started a bit of work working with farmers on a project called Farmers for Climate Solutions. And this is a coalition working here in Canada, made up of farmers, led by farmers, to really identify that, you know, a large number of GHG emissions are actually caused by agriculture. Agriculture is a huge contributor. The big kind of, you know, agri-food and agriculture more generally is one of those big things, including fashion and other things that are really driving climate change. And so how can farmers be leaders in thinking about what climate change looks like? And how can climate change policy actually think about farmers and seeing a partnership there? And that's a really interesting conversation in Canada because our farming population isn't very diverse. Our average farmer is over the age of 65 and they're looking to age out. So we have an opportunity to think about how do we diversify our farmers and the thinkers at the table in this solution by bringing young people to the table. How do we think about it, about bringing the many immigrants we have coming to Canada? We're coming from farming countries and have that knowledge. How do we diversify that by tapping into the indigenous and traditional knowledges of people who may not call themselves farmers, but are stewarding and taking care of the land in a way and practicing regenerative land practices that really are tuned to the solutions that climate change use and is trying to implement, and also that farmers are increasingly bringing to their practice. So how do we build these intersections and knowledge sharing opportunities to advance the conversation of an intersectional approach to climate change?
Wow, that's so powerful. I you know, the example that you had just provided from the work that doesn't work, it's yet another example of what happens when a westernized mindset enters a community in a region that they don't understand, proposing a solution without considering why the community has been doing the things that they've been doing in the first place. It makes me just, the easy example I can think of is the Tom's 1-for-1 model that that has been used as a glaring example of what doesn't work. And for those who might not be familiar, Tom's was started with a well-intention, and they believe that their solution was to donate shoes to a certain population in Africa. And researchers continue to point that that model doesn't work, but it's been adopted by so many organizations here in the US. So that's, yet another glaring example of what happens when you don't have these folks as part of the table. I think Leslie has a lot to say too about the ingenuity of farmers. I wanted to, Yemi isn't here, but that, the work that you're talking about diversifying who is in agriculture now, that's some of the work that Yemi's doing with Oko Farms. She's working with a lot of young folks here in New York, and a lot of them are Black and Indigenous people of color, and that's a lot of her educational work. But Leslie, I know that you wanted to talk too, continuing this conversation about farmers, to talk about the ingenuity of farmers in your work as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like that also just is deeply connected to issues of climate, and this whole kind of question of intersectionality is one that has followed me my entire career. Kind of in also studying international development and environmental science, I kept being told by different folks, like, you got to choose. You either go into the sciences, the hard environmental sciences, or you go the social science route with international development. And I mean, my perspective was like, no, I would go back and forth between my political economy of Latin America courses to my soil science courses to my atmospheric science courses, and then back to kind of the social science courses. And you're able to draw the connections between the two. So like, you can't understand the conditions under which a rural farmer in Ethiopia is making decisions if you don't understand kind of the household economics of that space and of that community, and kind of the sort of more social and cultural pieces that are guiding that decision making. But you also need to understand what kind of soil that farmer is working with, what kind of land that farmer is working on, what are the traditional kind of agricultural practices that are deeply rooted to stewardship of that land, and of working within the ecology of that space in order to produce food for that community. And I mean, this is all present within the traditional knowledge that is and power of those communities. I feel like many organizations just need to do more of that work of creating space to bring that power to the fore that already exists, as opposed to this idea that that power needs to come in from outside. And so, I mean, in the context of climate, I think that working in Ethiopia, for example, then I was doing a lot of work with teff and teff farmers there. Teff, for those who aren't familiar, is the tiny cereal grain that's ground down into flour and used to make injera, which is the spongy flatbread that kind of is a staple grain in the Ethiopian diet. And it's delicious, but it's also extremely, extremely small. And so just as an example, at the beginning of the season, farmers need to time their planting of the teff so that the soil is wet enough for the teff to germinate, but not so wet that that the soil is flooded and the seeds will not actually take. And so it's kind of this balancing act of farmers having to kind of assess their environment and time planting so as to ensure a healthy crop. And as climate change advances and seasonal weather fluctuations become more erratic, then there are more instances of farmers having difficulty timing their planting. And so kind of in response to this, you often see farmers in Ethiopia and in other places of the world, like Nicaragua and Indonesia as well, diversifying from from kind of solely planting one thing to planting more horticultural crops that may be more so basically, if you're planting multiple things, then, and there happens to be less rain this season, then you may still have crops that are able to survive, and so you're able to kind of hedge your bets. And so, I mean, farmers are economists, farmers are scientists, farmers are constantly kind of tweaking and experimenting and optimizing their environments in ways that I think we could all draw and learn from. My friend and colleague Letitia Diewo, who directs the Black Creek Community Farm here in Toronto, recently was also reminding me of the importance of kind of connecting the conversations about climate, about agriculture, about systems change here to what's happening in other parts of the world, specifically the continent of Africa. it's because these conversations should not be happening in a vacuum, and because there are innovations that are happening in these communities that we can draw from and use to inform the decision making that we and the way that we approach kind of the solution finding process on our end. And kind of just to put a bow on that, I also want to just kind of re-highlight the excellent point that Milana made around kind of looking at who is driving the decision-making process. I think that that's cannot be stressed enough. I mean, my work now is within the food justice sector, but I think you can look at the climate justice sector and see very similar trends. The people who have been making decisions about what solutions should be led to address issues of food insecurity or issues of climate change have often looked surprisingly similar. They've generally been white folks, they've generally been upper middle class, they've generally been small-bodied, they've generally been straight folks. And so kind of as a result of that being the majority of the power holding decision makers at the table, you see a very specific kind of type of solution that speaks to that experience coming to the fore. In Canada, it's looked like huge support for the food banking system and for food pantries and kind of that sort of charity-led approach to ending hunger. Although, I mean, no shade being thrown at food banks, they will fill people's bellies for the day or for the week, but it's not going to address the systems of inequality and poverty that are keeping people hungry in the first place. And those are the systems that we need to be talking about, and those are what we need to be driving and dismantling in order to address these systemic issues. And I think that there's a lot of hand-wringing that gets done around kind of how to begin or where to start these processes. And so I also want to highlight that, like, there are very kind of simple solutions to addressing the power sharing piece. I mean, I think it begins by collecting data. It begins by looking at your organization and seeing or collecting race-based data about your staff members. At FoodShare, we have begun surveying our staff team as well as our board of directors to look at where diversity exists within our organization and where it's lacking, so that we can then take steps to address that. And those steps look like things like thinking about your hiring process. How do you go about framing your job application? So at FoodShare, we have removed kind of paid accreditation from a lot of our job applications, because we recognize that whether or not you have a university degree doesn't necessarily determine, like, whether or not you could afford to go to university doesn't determine whether you're qualified to do a particular job. It's also about looking at where those calls for applicants are going. So I mean, when we have a job that we want to post, we post on our website, but we also reach out to networks of grassroots organizations working alongside and led by communities of color in the city, and let them know, like, hey, we have a posting. If you have folks in your network who may be interested in this, then please share it along to them. Because if we're just posting on your monster.com or your Indeed, then you're going to have the same group of kind of fairly similar folks who are applying for those jobs, and you're not going to be getting those job applications to the diverse candidates that you want at the table. And it's not just about having diverse candidates at the table, it's about having diverse candidates in positions of leadership and decision-making power within your organization. It's not enough just to have people at the table. You also need to empower those people to lead, so that their skills and their perspectives inform the solution finding process.
Amazing.
Wow. That's incredible to hear about the work. I mean, that stuff I would love to talk to you outside of this, to just nerd out about what's happening in Ethiopia and the farmers. But I think you provided us also just a lot of really clear actions that we can take to make sure that those who are underrepresented in this movement are included, and that includes a lot of the hiring process. That is, that leads to really the close of this. Is, I would love to hear, and if you have more to add, Leslie, feel free to add. But I'd love to hear, what do we do? Like, what is our call to action? How do we continue to support this movement? How do we continue to build a more intersectional climate movement? And one thing I want to add too is, I think a lot of the burden of talking about environmental and social justice ends up falling on those who are marginalized and having these conversations. And the narrative, like we've discussed, often comes from a very white perspective where there isn't a lived experience in these communities. So, you know, what can we do? What can allies do to make climate change a more equitable and intersectional movement?
I think that's a great way to kind of cap this conversation. I was really privileged last week to facilitate, kind of moderate a conversation between growers, you know, people supporting communities of color on the ground. And it was with folks in New York City, urban growers in New York City, people in the UK, and people here in Toronto. And all the panelists were really talking about, you know, Black, Indigenous panelists and panelists supporting low-income communities about how, you know, how to do this work. And it's funny because I think the first thing that I would recommend for anyone to do is just listen. Spend some time listening. I mean, I think, believe it or not, like communities of color have been really saying the same things over and over again. Like we're in this kind of racial justice awakening moment, but nothing has really changed in the sense that like there aren't new messages coming from, you know, Black, Indigenous communities of color. It's the same thing. So I think it's a moment to truly listen and then take that listening to ask yourself, from what I heard, how can I contribute to that? So instead of being like, I could do this, is actually responding to the call. And then once you think you can do that, before even suggesting that, leaning into that community and to those folks and asking, how can I contribute to this? How can I support you? And, you know, I think that's really overwhelming for people. They're like, I'm not connected. I don't know where to start. Start with people you know. I think, you know, we're really lucky to live in such diverse societies. And I imagine that everyone knows or works or lives near someone who is different than them, someone who is facing challenges that are maybe outside the scope of their lived experience. And I think that's a great place to start. Start by looking at organizations doing that work, who are demonstrating leadership around, you know, whether it's hiring practices. We heard about how intersectional these challenges are and how low-income people really feel the brunt of not only economic injustice, but climate injustice. And understanding that supporting those folks is actually climate work. Climate work is not only planting trees, going to the climate march, you know, working in a community garden. Like you like, because the work is so deeply embedded with systemic inequalities that span across these areas we talked about today, the work has to move beyond that. It has to be about more than that for it truly to be climate justice work. And I think that's the biggest kind of hurdle for people to get their mind around when they're thinking about solutions and how they can contribute. And so, you know, to speak to that idea, I think we need to imagine climate justice work as work to support diverse leadership, as we heard. We need to think about, so whether that's you can support someone, whether that's you have the power to hire someone, whether you have the power to recommend someone, whether it's that you have the power to, you know, connect and introduce them. I think that is radical work. I think even more than that, thinking about how, you know, climate work is so much about land, so much about the environment, so much about nature. Well, let's start talking about, you know, redistribution, radical redistribution of land. And I know some people might think, you know, like, well, you know, I don't own any land. I live in a, you know, in a walk up in New York, or I live in an apartment building or a condo somewhere. But I think we need to think beyond that. If you've got a backyard, you've got growing space, you've got maybe a couple of extra dollars. I know there's an incredible movement called the Resource Movement. I definitely recommend folks look it up. That is a radical way to redistribute your wealth, little by little, supporting real grassroots radical efforts that support the people who are most disenfranchised by climate issues. You know, even here in the city of Toronto, when you look at areas that are more susceptible to flooding and can't get food to them, those are racialized communities. So, you know, you can start small. Maybe you have a plot and you're growing and you're looking to donate it to a community organization, or you're looking to support other folks at a farmer's market, and you have a stand and you want to actually share your stand with someone. There's lots of ways to distribute your power and privilege to support people. And it's just about thinking outside the box. And when you use an intersectional lens, it becomes all the more easier to think about how you can do that work. I think the last thing I'll say is, you know, supporting Black and racialized businesses. This COVID-19 has hit people so hard economically. And I was really pleased to see a lot of movements to support Black, Indigenous, and racialized businesses in this time. But the key is it can't stop. You know, climate work is about sustainability, and we need to be able to sustain the movement and sustain the people who are cultivating that change and that new way of doing things. And I think in order to have those really cool radical places that Yemi talked about, in order to have that to continue to grow and support and build community that you can be a part of, you need to support those communities. So I think those would be my final calls to action for folks listening today. And, you know, happy to chat more for folks who want to reach out. I'm at Twitter at Robert Smilana and on Twitter. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, on that note, thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom and these calls to action. Before we close, where can our audience find you and your work and support you and what you do?
I'm not so much on the social medias, but folks can send me an email at leslie@foodshare.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, Leslie Campbell, and yeah, folks can reach out there. And I guess just before we close, I would also like to just kind of highlight the importance of trying to shift the frame around these conversations away from kind of the charitable sector as the folks with the responsibility to solve this problem. I think that what has often happened over time is that kind of governments and other actors have framed nonprofits and charities as the folks who are responsible for addressing these issues. And that's not actually the case. Many of these issues are, governments have far more power and resources in order to address many of these pieces. And as a result, people need to be contacting their local officials. People need to be reaching out to their kind of elected representatives and asking them what they are doing to advance the priorities of communities of color. What are they doing to shift power toward communities that have historically faced barriers to access to those spaces? And I think that it's important to kind of reframe that narrative so that we really hold the people that that have access to our tax dollars and that we vote for accountable for doing the jobs that we need them to do in support of this wider mission.
Awesome. And yeah, like I said, I'm on Twitter, so you could get at me at Robert Smilana. And yeah, or check out www.powerlab.ca to hear more about the incredible community power building work that's happening here in Toronto.
Amazing. I wish I had more time because there's so much more I'd love to talk to both of you about. But thank you so much for being part of this and for being part of this conversation. Yeah, and for everyone who's listening, this is the last panel on stage 2. Feel free to hop off and enjoy the rest of the Marketplace of the Future. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Leslie.
Cheers, Milana. Yeah, thanks.